It happened in an instant. The silence after 1,000 whispers, the breath before humiliation strikes. The conference room was filled with glass reflections and nervous stares. A single voice tore through the stillness, sharp as a blade, announcing a man's downfall in front of those who once called him friend. He stood frozen, dignity trembling under the weight of betrayal. Words like failure and incompetence echoed, not because they were true, but because they were spoken with authority. Yet beneath the sting of injustice, something sacred stirred, a whisper of purpose buried deep within pain. The heart breaks quietly, but its resolve is forged in silence. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, collected his worn briefcase, and walked out into the rain. The sound of thunder followed him, not as a warning, but as a witness to the moment a soul decided that humiliation would not be its end, but the beginning of its becoming. The rain didn't stop when he got home. It followed him inside, clinging to his spirit like a memory that refused to fade. The quiet walls echoed with what he didn't say, what he couldn't defend. Sometimes the deepest wounds come not from what others take away, but from what they make you question within yourself. He set his briefcase down by the door, its hinges creaking like an old confession. A faint aroma of coffee and lavender filled the air, carrying the soft hum of a mother's prayer. She looked up from her chair, eyes heavy with understanding before a word was spoken. In her silence there was no judgment, only faith that storms were temporary and purpose eternal. He sat across from her, unable to meet her gaze, until her hand reached across the table. "You don't need to explain," her eyes said. "You just need to believe again." And for the first time that day, his heart began to breathe. Sleep came, but peace did not. The mind replayed every moment like a cruel film on loop. Every glance, every whisper, every unspoken defense that drowned in pride's shadow. Failure had a taste, bitter and metallic, and it lingered through the night. He thought of how people turn away when success fades, how loyalty vanishes when reputation bleeds. But beneath the ache, a strange clarity began to form. Maybe this breaking wasn't an ending, but an invitation. Perhaps losing everything was the only way to learn what truly mattered. The city outside pulsed with life, uncaring and alive, as he stood by the window, watching dawn crawl across the skyline. Somewhere deep inside, faith stirred again, fragile but defiant, like the first light after a sleepless night. Not everyone turned away. The next morning, a soft chime broke the silence, an unread message that carried warmth. It was short, but it said everything. "I know what really happened. Don't give up. Sometimes hope hides in small gestures." He met her at a small cafe on the corner, the kind that smelled of roasted dreams and second chances. She didn't ask questions. She just listened. In her eyes, there was something unspoken. An understanding born from witnessing truth crumble under power. Their words weren't loud, but they carried weight. She told him that light doesn't fear darkness. It defines it, and for the first time since it all began, he felt seen. Not for what he lost, but for who he was still becoming. By nightfall, something had changed. The humiliation that once echoed through his mind now sparked a different fire, a quiet defiance, a vow that truth would outlast deceit. He stood once again before the mirror, not searching for strength but recognizing it. Every downfall carries a seed of resurrection, every scar a hidden script written by purpose. He realized the world hadn't ended. It had just shifted direction. Somewhere beyond the fear, a new beginning waited for those willing to rise through ashes. He whispered a prayer, not for revenge, but for renewal. And when he looked up, the reflection staring back at him no longer looked defeated. It looked destined. Days turned into weeks, and silence became his new companion. Rejection letters stacked like tombstones on the kitchen counter, each one colder than the last. The world moved on without him, as if his contribution had never mattered. Yet beneath the weight of failure, something deeper stirred. An ache not just for survival, but significance. The morning light no longer brought comfort. It brought questions. What now? How long? But even in the stillness, a faint whisper echoed through the cracks of despair. This is not where your story ends. He didn't know whose voice it was, his own, his mother's, or something divine. But it kept him moving, sometimes barely, sometimes on his knees, but always forward. There came a day when even faith felt too heavy to carry. Bills piled higher than hope, and the phone's silence screamed louder than prayers. He stepped outside into the gray afternoon, his breath fogging against the chill. The city was alive, but he felt invisible, a ghost among dreamers. He stopped at a park bench, sitting under a tree stripped bare by winter. The cold bit through his coat, and for the first time, tears came. Not from weakness, but surrender. He whispered into the wind, God, if you still see me, give me something to hold on to. The wind didn't answer, but a single leaf fell beside him, landing perfectly on his knee. A whisper made visible, and somehow that was enough to keep going one more day. That evening, she found him sitting in silence again, the glow of the city flickering through the curtains. She didn't speak right away. She knew sometimes comfort isn't found in words, but in presence. Finally, she said softly, You think this is about losing a job, but it's not. It's about finding your purpose. Her voice trembled with both love and authority. When the world closes its doors, heaven begins to build new ones. Don't let bitterness bury your blessing. Her words struck deeper than any sermon. He looked up, eyes wet but awake. Something within him cracked open, not in defeat, but in release. He realized faith wasn't pretending everything was fine. It was believing something better was being written in the dark. That night, he opened his old laptop one more time. His finger hovered over the power button, as if it were a threshold between what was and what could be. An idea had been stirring quietly, a small consulting venture built, not on greed, but integrity. It sounded impossible, absurd even. But then again, so did fate. He smiled faintly, remembering his mother's words. Heaven builds new doors. Maybe this was one. His pulse quickened as he opened a blank document and typed the first line of a business plan. The glow from the screen reflected in his eyes like dawn breaking inside a man. He wasn't rebuilding a career. He was rebuilding a calling. The next morning, the air felt different, not easier, but clearer. He put on his best shirt, not because he had somewhere to go, but because he decided to begin. Hope doesn't shout. It whispers in the rhythm of small steps. He walked to a local co-working space, clutching his laptop like a lifeline. The receptionist greeted him with a smile that felt like grace. He rented the smallest desk in the room. Just a chair, a lamp, and a dream too stubborn to die. As he sat down, the world outside kept rushing by, but inside, time stood still. Every story of redemption begins with one decision to rise. And in that moment, he did. The first days were quiet, too quiet for comfort, yet sacred in their simplicity. There were no meetings, no applause, no guarantees. Just a man, a desk, and a dream that refused to die. Each keystroke was a prayer. Each email sent a declaration that hope still breathed. Doubt was a constant visitor, but so was faith. It lingered in the hum of his old laptop, in the whisper of his mother's prayers echoing from memory. When you start again from nothing, you learn that purpose doesn't shout. It whispers through persistence. He worked through nights that bled into dawn, fueled not by certainty, but by belief that meaning grows from the soil of struggle. And somehow, that was enough to keep the fire alive. She found him again weeks later in that same co-working space. Different shirt, same fire. She smiled. The kind of smile that speaks before words do. Still fighting, she asked. He nodded, and she sat beside him, offering not advice, but presence. Together, they brainstormed, planned, dreamed. She believed in him when he barely believed in himself. Sometimes faith wears a familiar face. Sometimes grace sits across from you with a notebook and an encouraging grin. And in that small room, surrounded by the hum of other dreamers, something extraordinary began to unfold. Part partnership, part providence. Days turned into purpose. What began as survival slowly evolved into vision. He built one client at a time. Small businesses, startups, people who trusted his integrity more than his portfolio. He offered more than strategy. He offered heart. There were sleepless nights and unpaid invoices, but he pressed on. When exhaustion whispered, he remembered the boardroom that tried to bury him, and smiled. They hadn't buried him. They'd planted him. And now, roots of faith were breaking through concrete. There came a morning when he looked up and realized he was no longer surviving. He was building. He had a company name now, a few loyal clients, and something far greater, peace. The kind that doesn't depend on circumstance, the kind that comes from alignment with purpose. He walked outside with his coffee, watching the sunrise paint the city gold. The same skyline that once mocked him now seemed to bow in reverence. It wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about proving faith right. Fate has a strange sense of timing. One afternoon, an unfamiliar number flashed on his phone. He almost ignored it until he heard the name. The same company that had once cast him out, now seeking his expertise. His breath caught. The irony wasn't lost on him, but instead of anger, he felt peace. Sometimes God doesn't give revenge. He gives revelation. He smiled softly, replying with calm professionalism. The past was no longer his prison. It was his platform. What once broke him had now built him. The meeting was set for Friday. As he closed the call, memories of humiliation flashed like lightning in his mind. The boardroom, the accusations, the silence that followed. But this time there was no bitterness, no trembling in his chest, just purpose. Life had come full circle, and grace had given him a front-row seat to his own redemption. He wasn't going back to prove them wrong. He was going to prove that faith never fails. Sometimes destiny sends you back to the very place that broke you, not for revenge, but for revelation. He walked through those glass doors again, but this time, his heart didn't tremble. It steadied. The same marble floors, the same scent of ambition in the air. Only now, he stood taller, not in pride, but in peace. People glanced up from their desks, whispers trailing behind him. He was no longer the man they dismissed. He was the man they now needed. Every step was an echo of grace reclaiming ground once lost. And as he waited outside the conference room, a quiet smile tugged at his lips. The storm that once broke him had returned to find him unshaken. When he entered the boardroom, time seemed to hold its breath. The man behind the desk looked older now. Same sharp suit, same cold eyes, but something hollow behind them. Power fades quickly when built on pride. "Mr. Cole," the man began, his voice calculated yet uncertain. "We're hoping your firm can help us recover from recent issues." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. But Daniel didn't gloat. He simply nodded, offering the same courtesy he was once denied. Mercy carries a power that ego will never understand. The meeting stretched on for hours. Charts, strategies, and plans filled the screen, but the real story was written in the air between them. The man who once commanded the room now sought approval with every glance. Daniel didn't use his voice to conquer. He used it to serve. True leadership doesn't shout. It stands in quiet strength. When the final slide ended, silence lingered, not of fear, but respect. One by one, the executives nodded, and even the man at the head of the table looked down, humbled. The tables hadn't just turned. They'd been redeemed. When it ended, applause never came, but it didn't need to. Respect had replaced mockery. As Daniel gathered his notes, the man who once humiliated him extended a hesitant hand. "You've built something remarkable," he said, voice low. Daniel shook his hand without hesitation, his eyes steady and kind. "Everyone deserves a second chance," he replied. That was the difference. Where pride had condemned, grace chose to redeem. As he walked out into the golden evening light, the world felt different. Or maybe he was. Sometimes victory isn't shouted. It's carried quietly, in the peace of a soul that chose forgiveness over vengeance. Success didn't roar. It whispered through long nights and honest work. His company began to flourish, not because of wealth or connections, but because integrity has a language the world never forgets. Clients came through referrals, each one drawn to something rare: truth. As projects multiplied, his small team grew, guided by faith, not ambition. Every milestone felt surreal, not as triumph, but testimony. He often paused to look around his humble office, remembering the man who once walked through rain with a broken heart. That man was gone. In his place stood someone refined by fire, proof that the unseen hand of grace moves even when the world looks away. What made his firm different wasn't its profits, it was its purpose. He hired those the world had overlooked, the ones who carried scars but still dreamed. His office became a haven for the resilient, a place where second chances turned into success stories. Clients didn't just leave with strategies. They left with hope. He realized leadership wasn't about being above others. It was about lifting others higher. Each day, his work became worship, his meetings became ministry. In a world obsessed with competition, he chose compassion. And it turned out to be the greatest strategy of all. The city began to notice. News outlets wrote about a small firm with integrity at its core, led by a man who once lost everything. Invitations poured in. Speaking events, interviews, partnerships. But he stayed grounded, always deflecting praise to something greater than himself. "Grace built this," he would say. The same people who once avoided his name now whispered it with respect. The whispers had changed tone, from gossip to gratitude. And in quiet moments, he realized this wasn't revenge. It was redemption, multiplied. Then came the news he never expected. His old company, once untouchable, was collapsing under scandal. Corruption, fraud, layoffs. The empire that had mocked him was now begging for mercy. He sat in silence, staring at the headline, feeling no triumph, only sorrow. Pride had destroyed what truth could have saved. The same voice that once fired him was now reaching out, desperate and broken. And though part of him wanted to turn away, another part whispered, "Forgive." Sometimes the true test of success isn't what you build. It's how you respond when the tables turn. The next morning, his assistant announced a call. The voice on the other end was fragile, stripped of arrogance. "Daniel," it said, "we need your help." The pause that followed carried years of unspoken regret. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, and whispered a silent prayer. It wasn't about pride anymore. It was about purpose. Grace had brought him full circle. "Send me the details," he replied softly. Mercy wasn't weakness. It was mastery. In that moment, the man who once lost everything had become the man everyone needed, and he answered with humility. When the meeting was arranged, the irony was almost too divine to ignore. The same office that once dismissed him in shame now reached for him in desperation. He arrived not as an employee, but as a consultant, leader, healer, redeemer. The marble halls felt smaller now, stripped of their arrogance. Power had lost its polish. He walked calmly toward the conference room where fear now sat in the seats once filled with pride. There was no anger in his heart, only clarity. Sometimes God doesn't remove us from the fire. He refines us through it, so that when the furnace burns others, we can bring the water. He looks smaller now, the man who once loomed over everyone. The lines on his face told stories of sleepless nights and unraveling lies. When he rose to greet Daniel, His handshake trembled. "You were right," he said softly, eyes downcast. But Daniel didn't want apologies. He wanted change. Redemption doesn't begin with words. It begins with humility. As they spoke, it became clear that the company's collapse wasn't punishment. It was purification. Pride had fallen, but grace had entered. And Daniel, who once walked out of this place broken, now walked in whole. He didn't lecture. He listened. Then, with patience and precision, he outlined a plan to rebuild what pride had destroyed. Every slide, every word, was anchored in integrity, the very virtue they once mocked him for. As he spoke, the board members leaned forward, captivated not by power, but by peace. Redemption has a sound. It's the hush that fills a room when truth returns. And as the plan unfolded, even the most hardened executives felt it. This wasn't business recovery. It was spiritual restoration disguised as strategy. When the presentation ended, silence filled the room like air after a storm. Richard stood slowly, his voice faltering as he spoke. "I wronged you," he confessed. The words carried decades of arrogance collapsing in one breath. Daniel said nothing for a moment, then stepped forward, placing a hand on the man's shoulder. "We all fall," he said quietly. "But it's never too late to rise." The entire room seemed to exhale. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. And in that sacred stillness, both men stood as equals. One forgiven, one free. That evening, as he left the building once more, the weight of years lifted from his shoulders. He realized forgiveness doesn't just free others. It frees the forgiver. The rain that began to fall wasn't cold this time. It was cleansing. Every drop carried memory, mercy, and meaning. As he walked through the soft downpour, he looked up at the sky and smiled. The same heavens that had once felt silent were now singing over him. He had lost everything and gained himself. And that was the truest victory of all. Weeks later, he received an invitation. An awards gala, hosted by the same business association that once applauded his downfall. The irony didn't sting this time. It smiled. He was to be honored for ethical leadership and community impact. As he read the letter, he felt no pride, only gratitude. The world had finally recognized what heaven already knew, that integrity outlasts influence. He turned to his reflection, adjusting his tie, whispering a quiet prayer of thanks. Sometimes God doesn't remove your enemies. He seats you at their table, not to humiliate, but to heal. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers and polished ambition. Conversations buzzed, laughter mingled with the soft hum of violins. As he entered, heads turned. Some in shock, others in shame, many in respect. At the far end of the room stood the man who once broke him, now merely a guest in a story that had outgrown him. Their eyes met across the crowd. No anger, no bitterness. Just history acknowledged in silence. He realized forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering without pain. Midway through the ceremony, as the host prepared to present Daniel's award, a voice called from the crowd. It was him. The same voice that once condemned now trembled with humility. "Before this man is honored," Richard began, "I must say something." The room fell silent. He spoke of his mistakes, his pride, his fall. He confessed the truth before hundreds, his voice cracking beneath the weight of redemption. Then he turned toward Daniel. "I wronged you, and you taught me what real strength looks like." The crowd waited for Daniel's response, but he didn't speak right away. He simply stood, walked forward, and embraced him. And in that single act, the world witnessed grace in motion. The applause that followed wasn't for success. It was for salvation. It wasn't the sound of admiration, but awakening. He accepted the award with humility, speaking not of himself, but of grace. "This," he said, holding the trophy, "isn't proof that I rose. It's proof that forgiveness works." The audience stood, tears and applause blending into something sacred. In that moment, he realized the journey had never been about revenge, but revelation. The same fire that once burned him now illuminated others. Later that night, under a quiet sky, he stood outside with his mother and Mia. The city lights glimmered below, but the stars above burned brighter. "You did it," his mother whispered, her hand resting gently on his arm. He smiled and shook his head. "No," he said softly. "God did." The wind stirred around them, warm and gentle, as if heaven itself exhaled approval. The pain, the loss, the humiliation. It had all been the soil of destiny. Forgiveness had not only changed his story, it had rewritten others. And as dawn's first light touched the horizon, he closed his eyes and whispered, "Thank you for the fire that forged me."